Okay, hello. Can you all hear me? Yes. Oh, good. Okay, welcome. I'm Allison McFarlane. I'm the director of the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at the University of British Columbia. And I want to welcome you all to the 2025 Lind Initiative Speaker Series. This is our kickoff event. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that we're gathered here today in this beautiful corner of the world on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Musqueam peoples. These lands have been a place of learning, connection, and stewardship for countless generations, and we're really grateful for the opportunity to gather here and continue the tradition of sharing knowledge and ideas, as we're going to do this evening. Excuse me. I want to extend a huge thank you to the Chan Center for partnering with us to host this series this year, as well as to the Department of Art History here at UBC for making this particular event possible. If you haven't already had a chance to go over and check out the stunning exhibit at the Ava Gallery that's currently on display, I encourage you to do that before the end of the month when it goes away. We feel really fortunate that the team behind the BOM exhibit has come to UBC, and importantly, that they are able to do so through the generous support of the MacArthur Foundation. And I also want to take a moment this evening to thank the late Phil Lind, who is the visionary behind this initiative, as well as his family, whose continued generosity has allowed us to gather here today. Turning to this evening's program, the theme of this year's Lind Speaker Series is What It Means to Be American, Navigating Identity in a Changing Nation. And I know what you're thinking. Given how predictable, calm, and stable American politics have been over the past few months, what on earth are these folks going to talk about? Well, joking aside, the turbulent political currents that we're now seeing south of the border going on, it makes us feel more strongly than ever that the conversations we're about to have and will continue to have throughout the spring are really important. Now, before I introduce the moderator and tonight's speakers, a few quick logistical notes. We'll be taking audience questions in the latter part of tonight's event through Slido. So simply go on your phones to slido.com and enter the code hashtag LIND25 to input your question. So feel free to ask questions, to upvote existing questions, to make sure that the questions you're interested in are asked by the moderator. And last, a friendly suggestion to silence your phones. So with that, I'm delighted to be able to introduce our moderator for this evening, Professor Hugh Gusterson, who is cross-appointed in the Department of Anthropology and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs here at UBC. Hugh's an expert on nuclear weapons issues and the author of numerous books, including Nuclear Rights, People of the Bomb and Drone, and perhaps most importantly, especially to some of the students in here, Hugh is leading this year's Lind Graduate Seminar, which accompanies this series. Next, I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers this evening, Eric Schlosser and Smriti Keshari. Eric is a critically acclaimed journalist, writer, and artist of a number of award-winning books, including Fast Food Nation, Reefer Madness, and Command and Control. And both Fast Food Nation and Command and Control were turned into films as well. His work has appeared across many leading publications, including The Atlantic Monthly, Rolling Stone, and The New Yorker, and he's now at work on a book on prisons. Smriti is a groundbreaking storyteller and artist in residence with the National Theatre in London, the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and Pioneer Works in New York. Her award-winning work has premiered around the world, including the Tribeca Film Festival, the Berlin International Film Festival, and on Netflix and Hulu. So we're going to start with a 2-minute clip of the documentary trailer, and then you'll hear from Smriti and Eric. And please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
The spread of nuclear weapons is inevitable, then in some way we are admitting to ourselves that the use of nuclear weapons is inevitable.
Well, I'm going to go first, and I want to start by thanking everyone at the university. It's really been a wonderful time here, and it's been a great pleasure engaging with students and faculty. The subject of what it means to be American is something that we could talk about for days. Very specifically, one of the things it means to be American is to be a citizen of a country that invented the most dangerous technology on Earth. The nuclear weapon is a machine. It's the deadliest machine ever invented. And in one of the classes I was part of, we talked about the year 1945 as being a pivotal year. World War II was immensely destructive and deadly, with tens of millions of people being killed. And what came out of it was the nuclear weapon that was devised by the United States, destroyed 2 cities, and has never been used again since, but still poses an existential threat to all of us, and a threat that is not being discussed anywhere near enough. And that's one of the motivations for the work that Smriti and I have done together. I think it's also important to add another question. What does it mean to be Canadian? And on this issue, it means to have been complicit from the very beginning in the invention and the spread of nuclear weapons. The Manhattan Project was the governmental effort to create the first atomic bomb. And the Manhattan Project was a partnership between 3 countries, Great Britain, the United States, and Canada. And there were Canadian scientists in New Mexico who played an important role in inventing the atomic bomb. And when the city of Hiroshima was destroyed in an instant in the first use of a nuclear weapon, a significant portion of the uranium in that weapon came from Canada. From that point onward in the Cold War, Canadian officials were often very critical of nuclear weapons publicly, while privately supporting not only the United States and its nuclear program, but also NATO. It's not very well remembered that Canada had nuclear weapons on its soil, and that Canada would have played a crucial role in any conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, because it happens to have the airspace between those two countries. And I could go on at length about some of the operational details, the Canadian pilots who had nuclear weapons through their role in NATO. But unfortunately, this is an issue that affects all of us. And it affects all of us because the weapon effects of a nuclear detonation are not going to care about lines on a map or national boundaries. These weapons threaten all of us. And to me, it creates a responsibility first to become aware of their existence, of the threat that did not go away, but in many ways has become worse in the last decade, and then to do something about it. So thank you for having us, and I'm going to hand it over to Smriti now.
Hi, everyone. So my introduction to the subject matter of nuclear weapons came actually from reading Eric's book, Command and Control. And previous to the book, I don't know how many of you think about nuclear weapons. We've been asking that question a lot in the last couple of days while visiting classes. And oftentimes a lot of hands will go up. But if I was one of the people in the room at the time, my hand wouldn't have gone up because I never really thought about nuclear weapons. Yes, they were in the headlines, but it didn't have the same impact that I think it did for a lot of people that were born or alive during the Cold War or Cuban Missile Crisis, that there was this sense that with a 4-minute warning, the world could likely end, that people in school had to do duck and cover drills, that you could buy air raid shelters and they would keep you safe. I think for a lot of the younger generation, there just isn't that same similar kind of emotional experience with nuclear weapons. And a lot of the reasons of that is because we don't get to see them. It seems like it's something that has gone away. But reading the book really opened my eyes to the reality of nuclear weapons in the present day. The fact that we live in a world with 14,000 nuclear weapons, with 9 countries that have them. In the United States a few years ago, we just greenlit a $1 trillion modernization program, which recently they did a new study, and it's going to be about $2 trillion in spending. So how did we get to that point, right? And why is it that people are not on the streets and up at arms about it? If those headlines are there, how could you allow people to have a different understanding of nuclear weapons? How could they have more of a emotional experience of them? And that was really at the basis of when we were starting discussions of making the bomb, was to really create this powerful experience that really took people through those emotions of nuclear weapons. How could you use music and film to engage people in the subject matter in a way that wasn't didactic, in a way that really allowed them to experience it for themselves and be able to ask more questions afterwards? That was really central to the making of the bomb. And what has been incredible since the project had first premiered. And it initially opened as a big 360-degree installation with 30-foot high screens surrounding the audience, 1,000 people at a time, with a live score by the Acid in the center. It has been in art festival and music festivals, at the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony in DC, and we recreated it as an installation, and it's so exciting to have you guys host us. It's been incredible to see not just the reaction, but all of the different people that that are able to interact and experience the subject matter, because nuclear weapons feels like something that someone else is handling or someone else is taking care of it. And there have been so many people that from experiencing it have an entry point, and that this is just one way of the many that different people are doing who are in the world of nuclear weapons or who care about the subject matter. And I want to just touch on the question of what does it mean to be American. So I was on the phone with my mom actually just a few hours ago, and she has an incredible memory. And she reminded me, she said, do you know that it was exactly today, 20 years ago, that you got your American citizenship? Wow. Yeah. And I was like, really? Today? And then she sent me photos, and she's like, there's a citizenship. And I thought that was so ironic, and I was thinking about that moment in time. I was 20 years old, and I was so worried, and I was studying about the test, and I was thinking a lot of like, you know, when I'm in America, and I was born in India, when I'm in America, there's this question of, oh, am I Indian? And then when in India, you're so American. And you're always kind of going left and right within that. But it wasn't until maybe shortly after that time where you 100% feel both of those. And I was also so excited at the time to be an American and still continue to be. One of the great things, one of the reasons, you know, my family even moved, is that it is the place that is a great experiment. And people continue to define and redefine and question itself and look at the past and improve from it. And that so many people can come in from different places, and so many people can be American. When you move to France, for example, you're not quite French no matter how many years you live there. But in America, it does have that sort of, it's one of the few places that you can do that. And I often think about this James Baldwin quote where it says, I love America, where he says, I love America so dearly, and for that reason, I feel the need to criticize and question her to make her better. And I think about that all of the time because it's so easy to just think of the recent past few years and the people who are dominating the headlines. But then you compare that to the American people, and you look at the headlines of what has happened recently in California, for example, and how incredible it is how the American people continue to show up again and again for one another. And it reminds me of how it has always been people and civil society at the forefront of change, of these large movements. It was so much of people being in the forefront, being in Central Park, marching towards the reduction of nuclear weapons. We used to be in a world and at a point where we had 80,000 of them, and we now have 14,000. So that ability to change is there. And it's so much about our imagination on really trying to figure out how do we get there? And how can we question what we have done and change that?
Hi, everyone. I'm Hugh Gustafson. I'm your moderator for this evening. People can hear me? Great. We only have a limited amount of time, and I'm taking up some of it, so I'm going to jump right in. I will say, as a prefatory remark, the film is remarkable. It's here at UBC for a little while longer. I really encourage you to go and check out the exhibit, where you can see it on multiple screens simultaneously, synchronized with each other. And I'm going to begin by asking 3 questions about aesthetic choices you made in the film and about visual culture in the bomb. So I'm just going to jump in with the first one. When I watched the film, I found myself feeling very ambivalent, like there were 2 me's watching it. Part of me felt repulsed by what I was seeing, imagining what it would be like to be a human being nearby one of those explosions. But from a distance, they're very beautiful. There's something psychedelically exciting about a lot of the footage and the mushroom clouds. So I'm wondering if you could say something about the danger that oppositional critiques end up romanticizing and aestheticizing the bomb, and is there anything we can do about that, or do we just have to live with that?
One of the things with nuclear weapons often is that it becomes so quickly about the countries and which countries have them and them as symbol of power, and we need them because Russia has them and we need to modernize them. And you can easily start justifying it. But one of the reasons for us really focusing on it, on the bomb itself, and looking at it as a machine, that was a shift. Because when you think of them as machines, all machines, and this is something that's central in Eric's book, is that all machines, no matter what they are, will eventually fail. And again and again and again, there have been numerous incidents and accidents that have happened with nuclear weapons. So these machines that have never been used since the first time they ever were, almost 80 years ago in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we now have more and more of them, and are modernizing them. So when we looked at them as machine, before you know if any machine is good or bad, whether it's car, whether it's computers, you have to be, you are seduced by it. I mean, there's an inherent beauty in its construct that's just kind of inherent to any machine, even if you think of the body as a machine, right? There is the seduction of it. So there was something that was really crucial for us, kind of showing that there's this idea of these of them being really phallic as well. And that's one of the reasons why we got to a point where it was this argument of mine is bigger than yours, I need more. That is inherent. You saw it in the trailer, the way that they rise up, the way that they point at you. That is kind of inherent to nuclear weapons. And then the explosions and the testing, there were so many people and so much of the of photographs and footage of people that would just gather in their backyards to look at nuclear weapon testing, the way that people look at fireworks. And when you hear the reality, when you see the reality of the effects that those testing had on people, on animals, that dichotomy is kind of inherent to the quality of these nuclear weapons.
There's an interesting moment in the film where you show paintings by Hiroshima survivors of what it was like to be in Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, that day. The film has a soundtrack, great music by The Acid, but other aspects to the soundtrack. While you show those paintings, it's completely silent. And I wonder if you could talk about the choice, the decision that you wanted silence there, and why show paintings? Most documentaries about the bomb show actual black and white footage of the ruination that was left behind, and you decided not to do that. I'm curious to know why.
You know, the early part of the film, which is trying to show the seductive quality of these weapons, which can often be quite beautiful, shiny metal. And as Smriti was saying, the explosions, which from a distance, if you're not going to be harmed by them, can be quite thrilling, like fireworks, was accompanied by a kind of a driving, propulsive score that fit. And the Hiroshima section is meant to be sobering. And it seemed completely inappropriate to have any music, particularly any electronic music with a beat, behind the devastation of Hiroshima, except for the one of the Hiroshima panels, which we show. All the paintings are done by survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And, you know, one of the greatest nonfiction books ever written, Hiroshima by John Hersey, tried to put this tragedy into words. It's so difficult to do that somehow these paintings, in a less obvious way, conveyed the horror of it, I felt, more powerfully than the newsreel of destruction, which almost felt distanced. And in the same way, there's an enormous amount of imagery of the bodies and bodies stacked up. And we chose not to use any of that. And instead, we chose to show footage of survivors of Hiroshima directly looking into the camera and, in a way, asserting their individuality, not just as another body in a pile of corpses, but as an individual, unique human being whose life had been forever transformed by this destruction. So, you know, we wanted in that section to pay homage to and be respectful of and try to convey the horror of the destruction of these cities without being exploitative.
And I will interject parenthetically that in the class today, Smriti made a very interesting observation that when you show people footage from nuclear tests or from the actual use of nuclear weapons, in some cases the victims are animals. So for example, at the Nevada test site, the US military would put animals in different kinds of soldiers' uniforms to see which got burned and which didn't. When you show people footage of animals being harmed by a nuclear weapon and people, they often have more sympathy for the animals, which I found very disturbing but interesting to hear. So another question, the great anti-nuclear psychologist, Robert J. Lifton, said that the difficult project we have to embark on in the nuclear age is what he called imagining the real, right? You know, the real threat of nuclear weapons. And the temptation is always to put ourselves in the position of the people who own them and get power from them, not in the victim position. The weapons, in a way, have become less and less visible. They haven't been used in war since 1945. They haven't been tested above ground by the superpowers since 1963. They were driven underground. They haven't even been tested underground since 1992. The Nobel Peace Prize last year went to a Hiroshima survivors group whose numbers are dwindling fast. There are almost none left alive now. So there are almost no living witnesses to the use of nuclear weapons. So imagining the real becomes really hard. This is becoming more and more of an archival sort of paper memory. What thoughts do you have on this?
That's one of the motivations of this project and of my work in this field. I was very, very fortunate when I was researching my book, Command and Control, that I was able to interview people. I interviewed one person who was in a plane and watched the destruction of Hiroshima, and later went on to become a nuclear weapons designer. I interviewed people who had been present at nuclear weapons tests, one of them that went out of control, and everyone frantically had to go. He was on a ship, and everyone frantically had to go off the deck and into the ship because the explosion was much greater than it was anticipated, and radioactive fallout was falling on them. One of these weapons designers said to me that he wished that every world leader were forced to see the above-ground detonation of a nuclear weapon because it is such a humbling and chilling experience. And as in so many other ways right now, I feel like the danger is greater because the people who are in charge of nuclear weapons, not only in the United States and in Russia and in China, don't have any firsthand knowledge of the real. And the other thing that I'm very concerned about, and this is something that we talked about briefly, the rise in nationalism throughout the world is so unsettling. Albert Einstein, who wrote a letter to Franklin Delano Roosevelt that helped start the Manhattan Project that led to the development of nuclear weapons, also became one of the first prominent anti-nuclear activists within a month of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was creating an anti-nuclear group and speaking out against the very weapons that he had helped to create. But the danger that concerned him most was not nuclear weapons. It was nationalism. And the combination of nationalism and nuclear weapons could literally be world-ending. So we have throughout the world leaders and political movements that have forgotten where this form of ardent nationalism led in 1939 and in 1941.
So let's talk about the dangers then. Eric, in your book, Command and Control, you quote Pentagon advisor Oscar Morgensen, and he says, and I quote, "Someday there will be an accidental explosion of a nuclear weapon. The human mind cannot construct something that is infallible." And in the epilogue, you reference Charles Perrow's work on normal accidents.
Yeah.
And you talked in class today about how very tightly coupled, very complicated technologies, eventually it's inevitable that there will be an accident.
Yeah.
So do you believe that if these weapons stay around, it's just a matter of time until there's an accidental explosion?
I'm wary of the word inevitable in the social sciences. I think that our individual demises are inevitable, despite some of the tech bros who believe that we can live forever. But I interviewed leading generals, Air Force generals, who had responsibility for nuclear weapons. I interviewed nuclear weapons designers, launch crew members, bomber crew members. None of them could believe that a nuclear weapon has not destroyed a city since 1945. And even the weapons designers were astonished that no accident has led to a detonation. Now, why has that happened? The very first reading I did for my book, Command and Control, there was a large audience, and I gave this talk, and someone stood up in the audience to ask a question and began by saying, "I was in the Air Force. I was on a bomber crew. I had responsibility for nuclear weapons." And I was just waiting for him to attack me, because that's generally what happens to me when I write these sorts of books. And he said, "Well, I can tell you why no nuclear weapon detonated by accident throughout the Cold War." And I was just waiting to be attacked. And he said, "There are UFOs circling the Earth. And every single time we've come close to a nuclear detonation, they have intervened to prevent it." Now, I have no evidence that that's true. I think that the weapons designers who Hugh has interviewed and written about have done an extraordinary job. I think that the military and its discipline has, on the whole, been quite remarkable. But ultimately, it's luck. I really believe it is luck that has prevented the accidental destruction of one of our cities. And the problem with being dependent on luck is that eventually it runs out.
So I'm going to push a little more at the risk of creating a little disagreement between you. In the epilogue of the book, you say the place that really worries you is India, Pakistan. That if there's a deliberate use of nuclear weapons, that's where you think it's most likely, and that's where Smriti is from. So I'm curious to hear whether you agree with that, whether you think that is, in fact, the place we're most likely to see a breakdown in nuclear deterrence.
In so many ways, I always found it ironic that in the film Dr. Strangelove, there's an opening sequence where they open on a military base, and there's a sign, and it says, "Peace is our profession." And I love that. I'm like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think about, okay, so what are other ways to think about nuclear weapons or to visualize them? And or to think about how we are living with this idea of having nuclear weapons as a form of deterrence. Because deterrence, you know, the mutually assured destruction, this idea that because I have them and you have them, we're going to have peace and we'll be okay. But it's so much of like both of us, Hugh, you and I, right, holding a gun to each other's head, having gasoline all over, then deciding to smoke cigarettes and just agreeing on the fact that we're going to have a peaceful discussion because we both, that's what we want. And that's kind of, and the proximity of where Hugh and I are, that's kind of the closer proximity of India and Pakistan. They're agreeing on we are going to practice peace. We are not going to annihilate each other, but we have the ability to do so. And it's a psychological defense. So we're going to continue on because we want our countries to be safe. But when you think about how these are actually machines that, yes, you can control a good amount of it, but you don't have full control of it. There's this illusion of control. And they are going back to the understanding of them of like, they are machines that will, something might go wrong, something could fail. And they do pose such a big threat to the countries that have them because of that, because they could fail. So we're just, as Eric was saying, hoping that we're lucky and nothing will go wrong. So I think India and Pakistan and the growing, you know, nationalism that is going on, there is actually a good chance between them. But right now, one of the things that actually worries me as equally is actually the modernizing of them, the amount of money that we're spending towards them. It's USA, it's China, it's Russia. It's the fact that we have treaties that are a little outdated. In the United States, there's a treaty known as sole authority, where the president has sole authority to launch a nuclear weapon. There is a treaty that expires next year that all countries have signed that there will be no nuclear weapons in outer space. And that expires next year, and there is discussion that Russia might not sign. And those aliens that have been keeping us safe, you know, are in threat. So anyways,
I just want to quickly disagree with myself. Okay. As we sit here, I think the most likely place a nuclear weapon may be used is Ukraine. And I think the danger has gone down in the last year, but I think it's very real. I think I can really imagine situations in which Vladimir Putin thinks it's in his interest to use a nuclear weapon as a demonstration or to destroy Kiev or to destroy some significant air base. The thing about India-Pakistan is that the United States and the Soviet Union hated one another, but they hated one another from long distance. And the religious differences and the fact that they're neighbors, there's something about hating your neighbor, not even in a national sense, but the disputes between neighbors in suburbia can be completely off the charts. And a couple of years ago, an Indian cruise missile, which was exactly the form of cruise missile that could carry a nuclear warhead, suddenly just took off and flew to Pakistan and landed in Pakistan and detonated. And it had a conventional warhead. And it was extremely concerning on two grounds. One was that it would have been perfectly rational for Pakistan to believe that it was under attack by India and immediately respond, because the flight time of a missile, a nuclear-armed missile from the United States to Russia is about a half hour. But between India and Pakistan, it's minutes. And so there's a huge pressure to respond and retaliate immediately. So it was hugely dangerous. But the other thing that was unsettling is that it seems that Pakistan didn't even know that it had happened until the missile detonated. And India later apologized, but to this day, we don't know what went wrong and how a missile that could be carrying a nuclear warhead took off, flew into Pakistan, and detonated. And so there's a real danger in that rivalry that one of them will deliberately start a nuclear war, but there's also a huge danger that you could have an accidental nuclear war between those countries.
We are told that the US has nuclear weapons to defend democracy. At the same time, as Smriti just indicated, the use of American nuclear weapons would be at the discretion of one person and one person only. There is sole presidential launch authority. That person, by the way, is about to be Donald Trump. He will be followed around at all hours of the day by someone, a military person with what's called the briefcase that has all that you need to launch American nuclear weapons. And on his sole authority, President Trump could decide to launch an attack on whoever for whatever reason. So I guess I have two questions. One is this really compatible with democracy? Are nuclear weapons fundamentally, inherently antithetical to democracy? And can we imagine changing that situation in the US? Would that be possible?
There was a wonderful essay on technology written, oh boy, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago by Langdon Winner. And the title was, Do Artifacts Have Politics? And what he was basically questioning is, are there political implications inherent in certain technologies? And he suggested, and I think it's absolutely true, that nuclear weapons are inherently authoritarian because the systems that you need to create them rely on secrecy, and the systems that control them also rely on secrecy. And the sole authority of the President of the United States to basically destroy civilization on Earth is as autocratic as could be. And one of the things, I have many criticisms of our current president, Biden, but one of the things that he was being urged to do long before it looked like Trump would be president would be to eliminate sole authority, which does not require an act of Congress and couldn't be an executive order. And what that would mean, everyone who is in who handles nuclear weapons in the military has to have someone else. Like there's always two people who have to turn the keys to launch a missile. It's something called the two-man rule. And the only person to whom that does not apply is the President of the United States. So many people have been urging a change to sole authority and ensuring it would have to be the President and the Vice President, or the President and the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the President and the Secretary of Defense. And given some of the people who Trump is about to appoint, I'm not sure how reassuring it would be. But it might prevent thermonuclear war simply because of a late-night tweet storm tantrum.
The other thing that I would add, and it's something that I think about, is that these nuclear weapons actually hold 9 countries hold the entire world hostage. They are holding 196 countries hostage, and that's a decision that they're making for everyone. Because if we get to a point where one country decides to launch a nuclear weapon, then the other one has to respond, and before you know it, we're sort of in this place where, and we have enough nuclear weapons to destroy this planet 8 times over. So if you destroy a planet once, you don't have 7 more opportunities to destroy that planet. So why do we have so many of them? And there was a great question that was asked earlier today by one of the students in Hugh's class about what is South America's role? What can South America do? And one of the most inspiring and incredible things that have happened in nuclear weapons is by the organization, the International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And they have essentially tried to get countries around the world to sign a ban treaty to ban nuclear weapons. And I don't remember off the top of my head what was the latest number, but I want to say that there's about 100 or so. And that's another way to think about power and the power that countries have. South Africa is a country that gave up nuclear weapons. So the opposite is also possible. And again, it just kind of requires the imagination of how do you get there? This organization, this International Coalition to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is a small group of people, a lot of young people who really thought of a different way and a way that they could do something about it, as something that also had a sense of hope. And in 2017, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, getting the entire world stage. And it was amazing at how it amplified what they were trying to do. So there's ways that we can kind of look at having a more fair and just way of coexisting with these weapons.
And, you know, one of the great successes, an extraordinary success of ICANN was that the United Nations passed a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. So one of the problems in the United States and in Russia and in China and in France and Great Britain and all the other nuclear powers is that nuclear weapons have been normalized. But then when you take a global perspective, you know, 96% of the countries on Earth don't have them. And South America and Africa and Pacific nations don't have them. So these are not normal things that we have to accept. And they are inherently anti-democratic. And again, the fact that one person can make a decision that's going to have ramifications for billions of people is madness.
So the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been ratified by enough countries that technically it is international law. It is against international law to have nuclear weapons. The 9 nuclear weapon states have pretended they haven't noticed that. But I can imagine, and there may well be people in the audience who are thinking this right now, people saying, well, it would be great to abolish nuclear weapons, but how can you be sure that the Russians don't have 5 of them hidden away in a cupboard and they'll bring them out during a crisis? And you've obeyed the law, you've been honest, you've got rid of your nuclear weapons, and now they control the world. What do you say to someone like that?
There are means of verification. In order to have a nuclear weapon, you need a nuclear weapons complex that creates those weapons, services those weapons, and has the delivery system to use those weapons. And with all kinds of advances in verification, you couldn't ensure that a country had no nuclear weapons, but the destruction that could be created with conventional weapons is quite extraordinary. And it's, when the United Nations was created, the very first measure that it passed was a measure to abolish nuclear weapons. And there was serious talk at the time. And even in the United States, there was widespread support, not only among the American people, but among the American military, for the American Air Force to become part of a United Nations Air Force. And the thinking was that any country that tried to obtain nuclear weapons would have to face the wrath of every other country. So, you know, I feel like one of the arguments against abolition is that it can't happen tomorrow afternoon at 3. And it really can't. But we can definitely set into motion negotiations and consultations that will first take nuclear weapons off of high alert and reduce or eliminate the danger of accidental nuclear war, and then have treaties and have consultations between the nuclear powers that recognize it's in none of their interests that these weapons be used, continue to reduce the numbers, and eventually get rid of them.
The audience has been very patient, and I want to now turn to some of the questions that you've been putting on Slido. Before I do that, let me just make one last remark. Eric began by saying that Canadians should resist the temptation to be smug and think that they had nothing to do with nuclear weapons. They were part of the Manhattan Project. Nuclear weapons have been stationed on Canadian territory. Canadian military officers have been trained to use them. There's one thing I learned from Eric's book that I had not known before, that I'm suspecting may be a surprise to some of you, which is that in 1950, a nuclear weapon was accidentally dropped on British Columbia, about 50 kilometers north of Vancouver.
We're so sorry.
There was an accident with B-36 taking off from Alaska. 3 of its engines caught fire shortly after it took off, and it decided it would be safest to ditch the nuclear weapon, which didn't have a nuclear core in it, but it did have uranium in it. And it did explode over British Columbia. It was a conventional explosion that presumably dispersed some uranium nuclear material. But just so you know that...
The wreckage of the bomber is still there, and I mean, you can hike up to find it. That's just an illustration of how much Canadian airspace was crucial to the Cold War effort that the United States led against the Soviet Union. I don't know if any of you saw the film Dr. Strangelove, which was about bomber crews that would be flying around 24 hours a day with nuclear weapons ready to get the signal to fly to the Soviet Union and destroy it. But many of those bombers were flying circular patterns over Canada in Canadian airspace, just waiting for the go signal to go attack Russia. And this bomber that crashed was on a similar sort of training. It was a training mission, so the weapon it had could not have fully detonated. But the United States and Canada have been complicit in many, many unfortunate things.
Okay, I'm now going to read some of your questions. So let's start with this one. How do you talk constructively with dogmatic realists? That's an interesting phrase, because if you're a realist, are you dogmatic? Well, how do you talk constructively with dogmatic realists who believe that the US must have nuclear weapons due to the fundamental nature of geopolitics?
Well, the argument that I make is that possessing nuclear weapons presents an illusion of safety. My book talks about how again and again we almost blew ourselves up. And one of the really crucial things that needs to be examined in the 21st century is the concept of nuclear deterrence. And that really can provide defense. Nuclear deterrence, as Smriti was saying, is basically saying, I'm going to annihilate you if you try to annihilate me. It's not a physical defense. People who are wearing a mask here have a physical barrier that prevents viruses and bacteria from entering their lungs. Nuclear deterrence is a psychological defense. It's a threat. And nuclear deterrence works until it doesn't work. There's nothing to prevent Vladimir Putin tomorrow afternoon from launching his nuclear weapons at the United States, destroying the United States. And when that sort of power is invested in one person, the danger always exists, not to mention Donald Trump. So I think it really is, the weight of persuasion needs to be on the so-called realist, that having 14,000 weapons that can destroy all of civilization within about an hour and a half is in any way a rational decision.
How many people here have seen the film Godzilla? Right? And so Godzilla, it's this monster that sort of opens its eye and destroys everything in sight without being targeted, specific, tactical, strategic. And that's what a nuclear weapon is. The weapons that we have now are 100 times more powerful than the weapon dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And anyone who works with nuclear weapons, that's not the weapon that they would use or they would want to use. So these are weapons that cost a lot of money. They're the dumb monster that could destroy anything in sight without being strategic. You would use low combat missiles, tactical missiles. There are other ones, drones, other things that we continue to use in war. It's the fact that we've got these specific ones that pose such a bigger threat. So I know it's a question that I get asked, and it's a fair one for people to ask. I had dinner with a friend the other night who was just saying, well, if Russia has them, shouldn't we? You know, that's a concern that people have, that us, the United States, will keep people safe because we have them. But it's not the weapon that would be used, and because of all of the reasons we've spoken about, they pose such a greater threat by having them. So not having them, abolition is possible, and it's the only way. There's a quote that always kind of stayed with me. I think it was Sagan, and he said, either nuclear weapons and human existence cannot coexist. One will eventually end the other. And that's a reality of, where we need to be thinking about with nuclear weapons, hopefully getting rid of them, not ending human existence.
So I noticed there's a factual question on Slido that I'll just answer very simply. The question is, does Israel have nuclear weapons? Is it one of the 9 countries? The answer is yes. It's thought to have 80 to 100 nuclear weapons. And one fear is that if Iran gets any closer to acquiring a nuclear weapon, something could happen between Israel and Iran. Donald Trump keeps coming up on the edge of our conversation here. So let's put him in the middle for a minute. How afraid should we be of Donald Trump with nuclear weapons?
I am not afraid of Donald Trump with nuclear weapons. Look, I'm afraid of Donald Trump. But it's really interesting that if you look at the statements he's made about nuclear weapons before he was even president for the first time, he talks about the nuclear power, which most people who are talking about nuclear weapons differentiate nuclear power, which are reactors, from nuclear weapons. So he doesn't use the right terminology, and it was pretty clear when he ran for president the first time that he didn't know what the nuclear triad was. The triad is elemental to anyone who studies nuclear weapons. It's the fact that the United States has bombers and missiles and submarines. So he had remarkable ignorance for someone who was about to be president. But in his public statements, he seems quite wary of it and seems, he doesn't believe in climate change, but he argues that the threat of nuclear weapons is greater, and it's the greatest threat in the world. So I think he will not be rash in using nuclear weapons, but the ideal commander-in-chief of a nuclear power is wise, emotionally stable, intelligent, and calm. And I don't know if any of those adjectives have ever been used about Donald Trump except by himself. So,
you have anything to add?
What I was going to say is it's less, I feel it's so easy to get caught up on all of the different things that our previous and current president-to-be says. The United States had 4 years of that. And of these claims, I remember the first few months of when Trump was president, what that sort of effect that has on the American psyche. And you're up at arms. And it feels like a threat that you need to defend or act or do something about. And you get so caught up in that narrative and then discussing it with people. But it's that magic thing of like, look over here while I do something else, look over here while I do something else. The reality with nuclear weapons is the amount of how much we are spending in modernizing nuclear weapons, and the fact that we are building an entire new fleet. We're not supposed to have more, but we're modernizing all aspects of the nuclear weapon triad, as Eric was saying. We are building systems for people to run who are not even born yet. So we are committing to another century of nuclear weapons. And it's so easy to think about, oh, what is Trump going to do? But the reality is that there's this entire private sector with it. And you've got companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and others that are benefiting from this, that are getting government contracts. And that is where the focus should be and can be, is on that aspect of it.
So I'm going to combine two questions. One is, what is the unique value of art and media more broadly in efforts toward disarmament? And I noticed that someone also wanted to know your opinion on the film Oppenheimer, which is a related question.
I think that that art is essential in all social causes, and that people who are forming the culture have an obligation that they fight against the destructive death wish in the culture. If you look at how the Cold War ended, artists played a large role in it. It's quite remarkable. I was saying this in the class earlier, that in the United States, the most widely watched television movie in the history of television was about nuclear weapons. It was called The Day After. I think it was viewed by, 1/3 or 1/4 of the American people. And one of the people who watched it was the President of the United States, who learned a lot in life from movies. And Ronald Reagan wrote in his diary about how upset he was by that film. And it was part of his transformation from being a believer in nuclear weapons and the possibility of fighting a nuclear war into a sincere advocate for abolishing all nuclear weapons. John Hersey's book, Hiroshima, is not only, in my view, one of the greatest works of nonfiction ever written, but it's one of the most influential works of nonfiction ever written, because up until the publication of Hiroshima, there was a very sanitized view of what happened during the atomic bombings. And this one book galvanized public opinion, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, about the real impact of nuclear weapons. So I don't believe in propaganda. I don't believe in agitprop, which is simplistic art that's trying to, pummel people into believing one thing. But I really, really, really believe in the responsibility of writers and filmmakers and artists to engage in the big issues of the day in a way that is promoting compassion and not hatred and warfare.
And Smriti, what did you think of Oppenheimer?
I will.
Oh, sorry, I forgot that part.
Well, I will say, someone actually had, there was a student in a class who said, this seems so big, what can I possibly do about this? And as one individual, what can you do against an entire nuclear weapon complex? And it's so easy to feel that way about nuclear weapons because they are so complex, the language of them, and it feels so outside of us, and it feels like we don't have them, as a country, so we're good. But it's always been, again, I read a book, a piece of art that really stayed with me, that had a profound effect. And it's always been art that plays that role for people, whether it's a piece of music, whether it's a piece of film, whether it's a painting. And I think that art really serves as like a mirror and a hammer to not just, it reflects back what is going on in society. And in that reflection or in that response, it also hammers in on this idea of, you know, what the artist, the creator, the people at the time believe in, of what they think is possible, what the imagination, what it can do. And so again and again and again, there's been so many incredible artists that have been inspired by the subject matter, that have been propelling and allowing people to have an entry point to the subject and doing something about it by speaking up and by showing, like, this is, you know, this is what I think, this is how it, you know, this is how I feel, and this is how it affects me. So I think it's really powerful when the way that it captures people's imagination. And after tonight, if there are drinks and 5 hours, I will tell you my opinion on Oppenheimer. But
I don't require the alcohol.
Yeah. But again, going into capturing, one of the most powerful things that the film did was capture the imagination of so many people about an event that happened 80 years ago. So that's, you know, that's really powerful. I think there's a lot that was omitted, especially the land where Los Alamos was. It was not just this. That's one thing that I do wish was included in part of it. But it was unbelievable, the Oppenheimer effect. There is a great book that was written last year by the author Annie Jacobson called Nuclear War Scenario. And Denis Villeneuve is adapting it to a film in the next, you know, couple of years. I believe James Cameron is also making another film about nuclear weapons. So I think we're seeing this moment in time where it's capturing the imagination of a lot of people. And the more that there is towards it, the more that, you know, shows that we care and we can do something about it.
I'll just give you my opinion on Oppenheimer very quickly. I think it was a brilliantly made film. I love that it raised the issue of nuclear weapons. I love that it brought people into the theater to watch a long film about an important subject. But my own personal view of Oppenheimer doesn't consider him heroic in any way. In my research, I found that during the Manhattan Project, he was personally doing calculations to determine the ideal height to detonate an atomic bomb in a way that would incinerate as many houses as possible. He was not anti-nuclear at all. He wanted the Army to have low-yield nuclear weapons instead of powerful hydrogen bombs. And I don't think there was a tragic story there, because I think from the very beginning, he was a deeply flawed person, not a hero. And interestingly enough, in my view, the people who really were responsible for the success of the Manhattan Project were not the physicists and the scientists at Los Alamos. It was the people at Oak Ridge, and it was the people who came up with uranium that was bomb grade that enabled the use of a nuclear weapon. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was so simple and so guaranteed to work, it never needed to be tested. So if Oppenheimer had never existed, and at Oak Ridge they created enough bomb-grade uranium, we would have had nuclear weapons. So there was a self-mythologizing that Oppenheimer did, and there was a victim narrative that he created when I think he was actually a much, much darker figure in history than the film conveyed.
Ooh, I will add one more thing. There's someone in the room, Ramana, who we were talking about this last night, and I have to include it because it's the Bhagavad Gita. And Oppenheimer quotes it, the quote, "Now I've become death, destroyer of the world." And Ramana, you please correct me because you did the research on it. There have been many interpretation or translations of the Bhagavad Gita into English, and all of them don't have, it's not death. That's not the word that was used. It was actually time. But he read this one where it was death. And so it gets quoted again and again.
It's in our film.
Yeah. And it's it's not accurate.
One last thing. Right after the first nuclear weapon detonated during the Trinity test, and Oppenheimer said that he thought of this line from the Bhagavad Gita, there was the person who actually, I think, flipped the switch to setting it off. And his line, I think, was more accurate, which was, now we're all sons of bitches.
So we have time for one more question, and I'm going to mash two together. So the audience has voted the top question they want to hear you answer. How would you address the threat of nationalism as Americans? And there's a question particularly to you, Smriti, as an immigrant American, in view of the massive turn toward hostility towards immigrants. How do you feel being in the U.S. these days?
And what was the first question?
How would you address the threat of nationalism as Americans?
I'll try that first part, and then you can talk about being an immigrant. I mean, the thing that I love about America is the strand of its nationalism that believes it's an immigrant nation, that celebrated the melting pot, that has the Statue of Liberty with that beautiful poem on it. I grew up partly in New York City, which has been an entry place for immigrants since its formation. And the culture I grew up in was a celebration of all kinds of people living on the same island, maybe not loving one another, but finding a way to kind of live in peace. The America that I love is an America that could have someone with an Austrian accent named Arnold Schwarzenegger as a governor, or Barack Obama as a president, and just have one wave after another of immigrants thriving in society, which is not to minimize the absolute destruction of the Native Americans that began the process. The nationalism that I despise is that there's one set of people who are American and real American, and the others are not. And sadly, the really ugly, narrow, divisive nationalism is what propelled Donald Trump to the presidency.
Nationalism is also something that we're dealing with in India as well, right? This idea of, Modi's Hindu first. And so it's something, and within the United States, I will say, in terms of my own experience, is that, again, there's a difference between the headlines, and then there's a difference between the American people and the lived experience of them. And it's not to say that that it doesn't exist. Of course it does. America is the only place that when you say American, it generally means white, right? Because everyone else has Indian American. They have African American. They have Chinese American. But it is also the place that you can be American. You can come there and be American. If you go to Spain, it doesn't matter if you live there for 20 years, 30 years. You're never Spanish. You're always, from the place maybe that you kind of come from. I live in Vermont, and it's a rural area. And again, it's very left and it's very right. It's both of them. But when it goes back to the American people and the values of communities and how communities show up for one another, that's really eye-opening. You sort of, in so many ways, people do put their politics aside and think about what does the community need. Going back to, most recently with the fires in California, the community has showed up for one another. The community has showed up to help, to support, to sort. And I think we all probably, when you think about your American friends, it again and again kind of shows up for one another. Although and it's the same with like family gatherings. Although there's there might be a sense of, these immigrants, they are taking jobs. That narrative that's kind of seems like it gathers more headlines. It's different in terms of the lived experience. There was a conversation, for example, my last film was about farm workers, and I think it was in the state of Vermont that they had offered specific farm worker jobs, and they wanted to only hire, Americans or people with papers. But the Americans didn't want to do that labor. And so they could only go to people who were willing to put up with the conditions that farm workers had to be able to do that. And so it's not, in a way, so black and white. And I think the farmers kind of also realized that. They were trying to do what you think that, the American people want. So the reality is it's a lot more nuanced than just, the right is against you, or people who voted for Trump is against, because in the communities where they are, people do coexist.
Thank you very much, Eric and Smriti. I'm sorry for people in the audience whose questions weren't asked. If you want to discuss them among yourselves, we had interesting questions about the implications of the rise of anti-science sentiment around vaccination and so on for this kind of conversation, the implications of the return of nuclear energy for nuclear weapons, whether the prospect of a small nuclear reactor on every corner, as someone put it, would be a shot in the arm for nuclear weapons. Questions about why the anti-nuclear movement seems to have fallen on hard times, and questions about further reading and viewing that people could do. So I encourage you to discuss these among yourselves. Thank you to our incredible audience. What an evening it's been. We'd love it if you could join us all again for our next Lind event with former Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger on February 13th back in the Chan Center. So thank you and good night.